All right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Grow Your Path to Wellness. Today, we have a really great guest, but I wanted to make sure that I remind you guys to go back to last week's episode. We talked to Miss Ryan King. She talked all about how to release emotions that are trapped in our body that can often lead to physical illness, which is a really great segue to today's topic. We're going to be talking to a licensed clinician, Evan, about the connections between trauma and addiction. And so how those unhealed emotions, again, can then, exacerbate into other conditions in our lives. My co-host, Kelsi, will not be with me today. She is on vacation, enjoying some self-care time. So kudos to her. Let her enjoy that. All right. Welcome, Evan. Thank you so much
Hey,
for being here.
it is my pleasure. Yeah, it's super cool what you're doing, and I'm excited to chat with you.
So give us a little background. Who are you? What do you do? How did you get into this field? All that kind of stuff.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I get that question a lot, so I have my like prefab answer here. But yeah, I mean, so I guess I was always interested in just psychology and people and human behavior. I think it was like an intellectual interest always. And that was combined with my mom actually growing up, she would run programs for adults with special needs. And she always, would have my brother and I volunteering, and it was a lot of fun. And so growing up, like if you go to summer camp, we were always the guys who were doing one-on-one with like the kid with autism or Down syndrome. So that kind of became something that I did like throughout college, and it was always like a nice way to have a job and, um, over the summers and like nannying sort of thing. Yeah, so it started. That was the first kind of helping profession I got into, and then I went to college and studied psych, and so kind of naturally segued into that. And then about like 3 years in, I mean, I guess this is not when it started, but I think it's when everything came to a head where, and I'm pretty open about it, but, I had my own struggles with addiction, starting when I was in high school and, everything did come to a head when I was like 2021 and ended up did a couple stays in treatment. And yeah, then, entered the life of recovery. And so, a lot of people will get into recovery and then I kind of call it like, they had the calling, and then they want to go be a drug and alcohol counselor. So I received the calling, but, I was already headed somewhere in that direction. So it, helped guide me. And I finished it's kind of like my resume here. I went, and it's actually interesting. So when I was finishing my bachelor's, I got a job at a place called the Pride Institute, and it's actually like the first inpatient LGBTQ specific treatment center. So it was a really amazing opportunity. So I was there as like a tech, and so I was there for a couple of years, and then I worked at one of the largest psych hospitals here in Minnesota. It's actually one of the largest in the country through the U of M and University of Minnesota. So I was working on like it's really unique unit. It's like an adolescent dual diagnosis locked inpatient. So, tensions were high, but, so that was an incredible experience too, combined with a nightmare sometimes. But, yeah, and then I went back and got my addiction, so I had the psych bachelor's, and I got my addiction degree. And then pretty shortly after, went and got my, my LICSW, my MSW, and then got licensed, as a clinical social worker here. Yeah, and I mean, and as far as like right after I got the degree in addiction counseling, I started my own business and I did like an intervention training. And I started doing a business where, kind of before it was cool, doing the telehealth and doing like assessments and making those services more accessible and doing interventions and family consulting, just like this fun little side business, which really helped me get through grad school and have, more flexibility. So that, kind of plunged deeper into the addiction world and then after started my own private practice and, Now my life's a little weird, but like I do, part-time private practice about half-time. And then I have a business where we do recovery housing and we specialize in LGBTQ. Yeah, so we have housing for people coming out of treatment. So it's like a fun, blend of things. And then, yeah, I mean, with the pandemic over the past 6 months or so, I've been diving into the world of TikTok as a millennial, so old man on TikTok. But yeah, so I mean, so I've been really focused on writing and creating content, and that's how we met. So I don't know, that's given me a little bit of some new lifeblood here, and that's just been really fun and kind of scratching some itches of creativity and um, in education. So I'd say that is the grand synopsis if I had to boil it
That's
down.
everything. That's so much. Thank you for sharing all of that. So
Sure.
can I just clarify, you have a bachelor's in psych and then also a bachelor's in addiction, or was that like
Yeah,
a specialized?
yeah, it's kind of interesting here. So Minnesota is actually one of the first states that made it a licensure. In a lot of other states it's a certification. And I actually went to like the oldest training program. And so there's different ways of doing it here, but it was like a technical degree. Since I had my bachelor's, I only had to do 2 years to kind of get this technical certificate. Here, you're able to do it at a bachelor's level. Um, so yeah, it was so it was almost like getting another major or something. But so I did like 2 years of coursework, and then you do like like 1,000 hours of internships. So I did a couple internships. Um, so it's like so it's kind of hard to explain. I mean, it's like a technical program, but it was an amazing experience for sure. And yeah,
Yeah, and I think as millennials, we all are doing that thing where we're like not satisfied with just the 9 to 5 anymore, right? It's like I want to be creative and do all these different outlets, right?
yeah, there's an interesting element there. I think there's like a dynamic. It's like a lot of us had boomer parents, and they were always taught stability. And I'm speaking in generalizations, and I don't know if I have all the research to back it up per se, but I think a lot of people could relate. That they were all about like corporate and stability, and you work hard, and you work your way up the ladder. You put everything in a 401k or a pension, and you retire. I think a lot of us saw what happened with them later in their careers, especially after 2008. Around that time where a lot of them, are getting close to retirement age and lost their jobs and lost their pensions, and that whole mystique of the corporate like climbing the ladder just dissipated. So I think a lot of us saw what happened and decided, hey, I want to maybe more follow my passion, or and be more creative, not work that 9 to 5. And we saw, I guess, how it made a lot of our parents unhappy. At least for me, at least that was my experience. And I think sometimes to a fault with millennials, or maybe in some ways we follow our heart. I think that we're swinging back in the other direction a little bit, where we go and get, especially with how expensive college is, we get, a lot of degrees that don't equate to job prospects after, then we're drowning in debt. You make these decisions with your 18-year-old brain. So I think you're starting to see a pendulum swing, and back in some ways to, more practicality. But yeah, I think, you and I could probably relate on that with, the having that itch. And for me too, just like business, and like I just love creating things, and like almost to a fault. Like I have like too many like LLCs filed with the state. It becomes a nightmare tax season. But I'm like, ooh, here's an idea. Like, let's do this, and then it'll like start to gain some steam. I'm like, oh, squirrel. Chase that one down the other way. So uh, that's my burden to bear. I have to keep myself focused, and if I want any of these ideas to actually materialize to anything. But yeah,
I know that's kind of how I am too. Like I have so many different creative interests that I just want to run with, and it's like, wait, follow through on one, and then get to that one. Like keep it on your vision board and then move forward. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of people appreciate relating to that. Whether it was like corporate world or like factory or like quote unquote blue collar work, it was like stay there and you stay there forever. Like you
Yeah.
don't job hop. And now it's like you want to leave somewhere after 6 months if it's not your fit, bye, right?
So yeah, so one of my like, manic endeavors was I actually started a recruitment business back in 2015, actually in the middle of grad school, and that's like a whole another long story. But we help some local and national organizations because of a clinician shortage, especially alcohol drug counselors. We do physicians, other things. But it's been a really good experience to, and I like mentoring people as well, like in their career development and behavioral health. Because I get an insider view into that. But when you look at resumes, the the five, that's increasingly rare, and it's really hard for employers too. But yeah, the 6 months, you're lucky to get a year sometimes, and you just find the next best deal or the next experience. And I don't know, there's probably a variety of reasons for that, but yeah, that same value's not there, like you said. And in those factory jobs, back in the day, I mean, those were actually pretty, I mean, despite some of the hard conditions and stuff, but you could raise a family. I mean, it's more traditional. You could have a one income earning household. College was more affordable, and we just don't have that. Things have changed so rapidly, and those jobs don't exist. And I think that's why you have a lot of, especially millennials, where we've really hit the brunt of these couple economic crises, and maybe a little bit jaded. So
I was gonna say, I think another factor in us, well, our generation, but I think just like currently now, even like Gen Z, and they're just kind of not, they're putting more of an emphasis on their mental health and wellness too. So it's like they're realizing if a job isn't helpful for them, it's not paying enough, and it's deteriorating their health and their mental health, then they're like putting more of a, an emphasis on that, which is beautiful, and which I want to segue into our topic today, because I could honestly talk to you about all the things forever. Today we want to talk about addiction and trauma, right? So like, how do those things define? Because, societally, when we talk about trauma, it can feel like you had to have had a really big event.
yeah.
And with addiction, there's so many points of that. So how would you define that for our listeners?
Yeah, so like when it comes to trauma, when I'm working with clients, I often use a couple different metaphors, and when I ask like, where have you heard the word trauma before, outside of mental health? And they'll say, well, oh, yeah, like physical trauma. Like, yeah, absolutely, the level 1 trauma center, and that's where that word probably came from before we started being enlightened on psychological trauma. But it's like like with physical trauma, it's a dangerous world out there, and we can get injured. uh, Life throws things at us, right? We've all experienced an injury, and a lot of times when we have an injury, our body has a natural healing process. So whether I use an example. One time I just totally busted my ankle in a martial art class, and for those like first couple of days I couldn't walk. My foot was swollen, and it got a little better every day, but then it got to a point where like I still couldn't run. I could walk, and then eventually I went and I did physical therapy, and they did all these moves to it, and then all of a sudden I could run the next day, and then eventually it healed to like 90 something percent, right? So that was like an example of a physical trauma, and it took a natural healing process, but then there was also an intervention to get it further ahead. Now the same thing happens with psychological trauma, where life throws stuff at us, and and so I say, like, a trauma doesn't have to be this big thing, right? You could have a variety of different injuries that cause trauma, that cause damage, and it's still a trauma. And the same thing goes with psychological, and it takes so many different forms. So it doesn't have to be, being a veteran, a combat veteran. It could be a variety of different things. And some wounds, will heal on their own. We have a natural psychological healing process. And even for some people, some big traumas, you could get to the other side in your brain's natural healing process, and others don't heal the same way. I mean, I think there's some certain events, being in combat, a natural disaster, extreme loss, that most all of us would have a trauma response from, and it wouldn't just fully heal on its own. I think oftentimes, we'll get to a certain point of healing where it's like, okay, it doesn't feel quite as intense, the injury doesn't feel quite as intense as day one, week one, month one, year one. But then you come to like a plateau point where it still has this negative impact. And that's where I consider like the trauma that, maybe requires some intervention, some therapeutic intervention that could take many forms. It's the trauma that lingers, and that's what PTSD is. That post traumatic. Now you could diagnose it after 1 month technically, but sometimes the healing process naturally takes more than 1 month. A lot of this stuff is just for as insurance billing purposes, and diagnoses are just these broad conceptualizations. But I mean these are so it is. This trauma response that doesn't necessarily heal on its own, and you could see the same thing with physical injuries. Many don't heal on their own. I think luckily, we have a little bit more ability now with mental health that we could, if you diligently work on some of these psychological issues with some of the evidence-based practices and other practices, it doesn't have to just be EMDR or these other fancy psychological things that we do. Sometimes relationships could be healing. People find it with yoga, holistic, whatever that may be, that they find healing. From these really severe traumas where sometimes, the medical community were helpless with some of these physical ailments that we don't always have the best treatments for. But, those parallels, I mean, it is, and we're learning more about trauma, that it actually does cause brain damage. So it's not just this like, oh, a nice little amorphous metaphor. There actually are significant changes in the brain that affect the way that we behave in our environment and how we feel and experience things. So, it's nothing to be trifled with for sure.
Yeah, and on that note, I would say it's not weakness, right? Like, it's not just a weakness when it's, a lot of societal stigma would say, well, if you say you have trauma, that's just an excuse, or that's just a weakness to not have to do things. And well, there's actual changes that are happening in my brain and body. Can you talk more to what I call, or we call, the little t traumas that people might not identify with as much?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the big questions I get on social media, and it's been interesting going on there to see what people's general knowledge levels are. And I mean, it seems like, and I don't know about your experience, but it's like a lot of the videos that I do on trauma, on personality disorders often that come from that. And I know the big one is like narcissism, and, a lot of people are survivors of that kind of abuse or parents and stuff. So it is legit. I think sometimes people overblow that a little bit and diagnose everybody. But I mean, I think it's some of those things that people have the most interest in, which is super cool to see. And sometimes like I'll learn some things from people. They'll be like, "Hey, what about this?" I'm like, "Wait, I got to look that up," and I'm like, oh, "I should probably know about this." But that's one of the big questions I get is people kind of putting their label as like CPTSD, and you maybe see that too. It's like, "Oh, I'm a survivor of CP," and usually they're referring to complex PTSD. And so those are two broad categories of trauma, which is simple and complex. And complex trauma, well, let's start with simple trauma because it's more simple. But it's like for the most part, and it's on a spectrum, but it's like one big event, right? Like a sexual assault. It's surviving Hurricane Katrina. Um, yeah, so I mean, it is more of like a single event type trauma. And then you have complex, which is like a series of traumas that stack up on each other. And sometimes, like when you have a childhood that where there's abuse, you grow up in an impoverished neighborhood with violence, whatever that may be, you're going to have a variety of experiences, and not all of them may equal up to a Hurricane Katrina, but they do really stack and layer upon each other. And, and that often becomes more intense and, some would say harder to treat because it gets woven into the fabric of who they are. Because early in our childhood, our development, our minds are much more malleable. And so when we're learning about the world, I mean, we're in this, rapid phase of growth. And when you start to have these experiences woven in, it changes how your brain develops. So, and then sometimes within the complex, you'll have these bigger incidents that are, more, so that sometimes they call it, the little t, the big, and I guess that's a little different than the little t, big T. But yeah, so the complex is you have a lot of those little T's. Maybe you got some big T's thrown in there, and you just kind of stack them up. And the big T's are those like really big events that stand out to you. Say you grew up in an abusive household. I'll ask clients. They'll have a whole bunch of events, and eventually, when you have so many, you don't remember all of them. But then there's a couple that stand out. The time dad came home drunk and I'm hopefully not triggering anyone too much, but assaulted mom and, we're crying, CPS. Yeah, so it's like those are like the big T traumas that really stand out to people and, really kind of generalize to the broader experience that they had. So those are some of the, general terms that people use: big T, little t, simple, complex. I guess that's the best way I could think to explain it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it because I think oftentimes when people hear trauma, they either think like level one physical or they think like military or like, sexual assault. Those are like what the go-tos are. And so I just wanted to make sure our listeners know that it could be so much more than that. Like I love the way you described those become interwoven into our development and who we are. And it really alters our perception of safety and stability and how we cope with things and how we relate with people. So thank you.
Yeah. Um, yeah, for sure. I think that is important to recognize because there are some traumas that are more subtle. And I work with people on communication, or I work with people in like relationships, and I mean it could be things like, I think one of the like a really big trauma that I see affecting people is certain types of parenting, like just being like labeling somebody, saying you're stupid, even if they don't mean it, right? Sometimes parents just say things like, oh, you spilled the milk, you're dumb, like, but those things really do like seep in, and you internalize them. And so in therapy we're like, all right, let's go into the basement here and clean up everything and organize everything, and make sense of it all. But like in cognitive behavioral therapy, they talk about these negative core beliefs that we have that are core, and sometimes we don't even realize how they affect us. But it's almost like a complex, like I always worry. I fear that I'm stupid. I'm sensitive to criticism because I was told that I was stupid, right? And then you build like an evidence base, like in court, it's like you have the prosecutor. It's like, and then you failed the test in third grade, and then and then you, never got your bachelor's, and then these experiences stack up on each other, and you can't really point to one thing. I mean, maybe you could say, yeah, your parents, once in a while, don't taking it a little too far and putting labels on you. But those are some of the things that are traumatic that can affect you. And some people are like, well, buck up, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And again, some of those traumas, right, like that, it's like there are some types of PTSD that like render you almost unfunctional. That develop into maybe a more severe personality disorder, self-harm, eating disorders that make life, like, literally put you at danger and make it so that you can't live this fulfilled, holistic, balanced lifestyle in your relationships, that everything is dysfunctional. But then you have everything else on the spectrum. So that's like trauma survival, if I could put it one way. But then you have, let's say, your kind of run of the mill individual that we've all had these things that everybody has negative core beliefs based on these negative life experiences. And you could easily say to these folks like, yeah, buck up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you could go through life just fine. And it's not going, and you could be totally functional and have a job and a family and some dogs, a vacation every now and then. But sometimes with those folks say, well, why do I need to do this? I'm like, well, it's just a quality of life issue. It's like, how happy do you want to be? Are you okay? Cashing in your chips now and being like, all right. Sometimes like when you do trauma therapy and you get to a certain point, you're like, oh my God, we're almost like, oh, I feel a lot better. I went from a 4 to a 7. I'm like, well, let's do a 9. They're like, no, I'm good. And like, I'm going to cash my earnings in now. And I'm like, all right, improve the quality of your life. It's like, I could see that, we could do more work, dig deeper, but it's certainly up to people how far they want to take it. So it's not always a life or death trauma situation. It is a quality of life issue. So yeah, I really agree with your point that we need to stop thinking about it as these, and maybe we need a different, or maybe the big T, little t kind of thing. But that's one of the things we do in therapy. I mean, I think all therapy in a way is trauma therapy. That we have this big
Well, we would
differential.
hope. We would hope we would all be trauma informed and working through some therapies. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, I think, yeah, I guess there's, the big, EMDR, and I do one called brain spotting, which I love. We can maybe dig into that at some point, but yeah, it's like, when we're, doing therapy, even with someone who's, maybe not as trauma informed, or maybe they're trauma informed, but they're not necessarily trauma therapists. But all those things that we are working on in therapy are traumas, and they may not be those like really big ones, right? That you maybe should have more trauma informed, specialized training to deal with these, really reactive, trauma, symptoms. That are really intense, that could actually be dangerous if you start to dig into, because with trauma, you build, even if you've been through big trauma, and we said there's some people that maybe their lives are not highly functional, but then there's some people that you find a way to survive, are really resilient. And some of that may be like, I just lock this in a closet and I put cement over it and I detach myself from my emotions. And that's how you survive. But, so everyone has different reactions, right? Some people, it's like they're almost like live wires, sometimes like with BPD, where you have, like this like high degree of emotional sensitivity. And then your adaptive mechanism is to find these external things from the outside, to help like put another like a false layer of skin on just to get through life. And so like folks with BPD, it's like a frantic effort to find these external things to feel okay and self-soothe, which is, most often a trauma reaction. And maybe you have like a temperament of sensitivity to begin with. Whereas other people, maybe put up, they build this wall over time and they don't need to frantically do that, they're just disconnected. I could think of even a couple of clients I've had recently like that, who were just like, you talk to them, they're just, almost flat, and it's like never too high, never too low. And that's a sacrifice you make from avoiding. And so then that's a scary thing, is like, okay, we're going to chip away at that concrete wall that you've been building for so long. And we're going to go into that dark room where you've thrown all your baggage and shame, and, kind of smells, it's like you want to, and it's like you've spent your whole life avoiding that. And so a lot of times when you dig into that, especially if it's extreme trauma, people, you could have a really severe reaction. I guess that was my roundabout way of getting back to that point, is you could have a severe reaction. And that's why it's important to have, some trauma training, or even just like having some like DBT and skills and calming and that kind of thing for when you are digging into that. But I guess the way I view, all therapy really is trauma therapy, even if it's not the big level 5 trauma wounds or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that like really describes trauma in the best way we could in the time we have, right? Big T,
Sure.
little t, complex, simple. How about addiction? How do you define addiction? And then how do you see those things co-occur?
Okay, this is where it gets complicated. And I think people like to distill addiction down in a simple way. It's like, oh, it's a brain disease, it's a trauma reaction. Yeah, I mean, I get stumbled up a little bit, because this is like the thing I want to say know the most about. But addiction is many things, and the easiest way to call it is a coping mechanism, and it could come from. It's like addiction is this like it's like a Swiss Army knife of tools that you could use for so many different ways of emotion, and like some people are just more sensitive to it. I think there's a lot of research that people that have more like ADHD minds and like dopamine deficiencies, and I probably fall into that category because with my addiction, trying to make sense, I had a really hard time making sense of it because I didn't have these like major epic childhood traumas that I could, I'm not going to say blame it on, but, connect it to. So I was like, literally like, why am I so screwed? Like my brother, my little brother, never really, to what I know, I mean, we're close, struggled with significant mental illness. And we had this almost the same upbringing. So why is it? And I think I'm just one of those like very dopamine sensitive people. Just drugs do a different thing. When they go in my body, it's like the pieces fit. And I'm home, and that's what you hear a lot of drug addicts, alcoholics. And some people now are, not using that term as much anymore, but, it's individuals with substance use disorders, but, I'm an addict alcoholic. So I'm just
Can I interrupt you for a second on that little pivot to that?
Yeah.
Because do you feel like that comes, and this is totally, feel free to not answer this. I see this happen often with people that are in the rooms, but are also in treatment. So they identify that way in the rooms and they fully accept that identity. And then they come to treatment and we're like, no, don't identify yourself that way. And there's this like friction.
Yeah. Well, and I do think there is, people are adverse to labels. And when I teach like a communication, I always, well, and most of the time, I guess I'm talking about negative labels, but that could be damaging, and that can, for some people, make the problem worse. So that's why I said with addiction, it's such a spectrum, and I guess I was getting into like the causes there, but now looking at the levels of it. So being that I'm someone who I have gotten sober in like 12 step, which is, you could talk about that for, and I still do it and I still see the value in it. But I don't usually recommend it. I mean, I don't recommend it for a lot of people until we've tried everything else. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it is just a higher level of commitment. It's, accepting that this is part of my identity. And I do think that there's freedom and benefit for doing it, but you don't want to pigeonhole yourself into that until, you've really tried other harm reduction methods, with some clients, and that's part of like having a good assessment when I'm doing and using my best ability to say, okay, where are you on that spectrum? Why is it, some people are just having a stressful time. Like in the pandemic, a lot of people's, especially with alcohol, you see that a lot where it's very much on, there's different levels to the game. And alcohol sometimes takes a long time for people to really render them, dysfunctional. But once that happens with alcohol, it's just as bad as any other drug, if not worse, and dangerous for you. So in the assessment, saying what level of care are you most appropriate for? So I really try to work with people. It's more fun for me because and honestly, like I sometimes steer away now in my practice from doing just the pure addiction, just because I've done it so long, and and I have much more the intellectual interest in trauma and having like the addiction and trauma piece. So it's like with individuals who are maybe, just like the pandemic, their drinking went up. I'm not going to be like, all right, you're exhibiting symptoms of alcohol use disorder, let's send you to AA. I think that's really damaging. And I think it does AA a disservice as well, because it gives them a bad taste in mouth. They're trying to label me. It's like, well, this is our program. This is what we're doing. We all identify this way. And then people feel like alienated by it, and maybe rightfully so. But like, you can't like put it on recovering alcoholics to be clinicians, and and so we kind of maybe put a little too much on them. And for many, many years, I think AA took the place of detox hospitals. Like detoxes, they send two guys to your house and they sit there for 2 days and wean you down off the whiskey. But now we have treatments and other cool fancy things. So yeah, but I guess my point was trying these harm reduction methods. Let's set boundaries around your using. And this is what I do too with other kinds of process addictions, like sexual compulsivity that I work a lot with, is setting some specific boundaries for yourself. And let's find a way to find more balance. And if that's not realistic, maybe we'll try abstinence. And the next level is let's try abstinence and then maybe reassess later, 3-6 months. And this could work for every level of addiction, but finding other new coping skills instead of using just the Swiss Army knife. Like we need to find a tool for each reason why you were using. And once you do that and you're living a more healthy, balanced life, you filled that hole that you have in you, whatever you want to call it, with healthy things, then using these substances in an addictive way is not as attractive. Now, here's where we get to the highest level of alcoholism or drug addiction, is this is where I view it as a disease, because you have people that want to just paint everything with a broad brush. It is a disease, it's not a disease. And I guess my answer is I think some substance use, some problematic substance use is not necessarily a disease. Um, it is like an ailment maybe where, your brain is doing these certain processes where you crave it, it's causing issues, it's causing damage. But, with a little bit of intervention, you could, whereas I view more the disease model as it is this progressive, chronically relapsing, most of the time ever worsening condition that really has altered your brain to a point where it is not realistic to be able to manage and control your substance use. And if you talk to people who get to that level who are in AA, which is most of the time it's a congregation of very severe, chronically relapsing folks, they'll tell you, like, I've tried every trick in the book because nobody wants to do abstinence. No one wants to be like, I'm going to cut this out forever. I mean, it's the scariest prospect for people. So, for them, they've tried and that's what I tell other folks, try everything in the book, try to control it, do it with a therapist, have some accountability, have a plan, give it your all. And if not, look, there's worse fates to have had than having to go to an AA. And there's other cool programs popping up. I wish there were more programs. I think, there are some, criticisms of AA because it's a historical program. People do almost treat it like a religion. It's very much not. And I think it's a misconception, but people treat it that way because they found, because there is like a path to spirituality there. And so they're reluctant to change anything with it, the wording, the language, now they're actually starting to acknowledge it with like gender, Christianity, but that was their base. I mean, these are people in the 1930s and it was a different time. So yeah, so as far as, the severe addiction, there are worse fates to have than having to go to a program because I tell clients like, look, and I look at these programs as like a buffet where it's like, they put together all these things that are healthy and positive for recovery that we recommend anyway. Have a community, have some accountability. Here are some tools here are some coping skills. I mean, all that stuff is built into this little, package program. And so there's worse fates to have because it's like I work, it's like, okay, go to like a few meetings a week, meet with the sponsor, get coffee, read out of the book. 4 or 5 hours a week of your life. And I sometimes will go through clients and I'll get a calculator out and it's like 2% of your waking hours, that and the investment you get on the other end for that 2% is phenomenal. And for me personally, cashing in that card of, not using anymore and deciding to be abstinent and kind of make this part of my identity. Everything I have, every amazing thing I have in my life is because I don't use drugs and alcohol anymore. And look, maybe I was young and maybe I could find a way to make it work. I could do that mental jujitsu, but why? It's like, why for me, it's like, why risk it? Because there's so many, like all the friendships I've made, all the connections, even like business related. I mean, I can't in Minneapolis, I've been here 12 years. I'm from Chicago originally. And I can't walk down the street, an uptown neighborhood. I can't walk down the street without running into somebody I know. It's always funny. My parents come visit. We walk around like every time we walk into 3 people that you know. And it brings so much like fulfillment into my life and other people's lives. So, but everyone likes to paint things with a broad brush. It's black and white. You're either doing AA or you're not doing AA. And it's, and so I just think because of how complex, like your original question of what is addiction and how complex it is and how different it is for everybody, there's different paths to healing. We don't have to pigeonhole people. And I think that's where AA got a bad rap because like that was like the only real tool we had. And so everyone was getting thrown in there in teens and adolescents. And it put maybe too much stress on the program and it put too much, of an emphasis on this one, and even treatments, the earliest treatments in Minnesota is kind of another founder. And that's why, like when I said I went to that first ever addiction program, Hazelden, and there are some of these other programs, even that psych hospital I worked at, that's where I think the first ever like peer treatment center, and they were like very 12-step based. All the counselors were former addicts and alcoholics. There weren't these evidence-based programs, helped a lot of people, but, we had to really try to unlearn that. And especially now, it just seems, and most clinicians would agree, that there's like there's so few of the pure cases anymore of just the alcoholic coming in, and it's like now it's just like layers of mental health and trauma. Not that the trauma wasn't there before, but I don't know, just things are more complex, and there's medication assisted treatments that help a lot of people. Yeah, again, that's when you asked me that question. I was like, where do I even begin? I could. How long is this podcast? I don't even know. We could go forever.
Yeah, you're like, do we need to make this a series?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, it sparked a lot of things for me too when you were talking. As far as, oh man, okay, so I agree with you that the first thing that came to mind when you started to talk was it depends, and like that's such a social work mindset. Like you can't ask me a question and I give you a direct black or white answer because it always depends, right? Like there's so many factors for each individual person that it's so hard to just be like
Yeah.
concretely this, right?
Yeah.
But then also there was a couple things you touched on, and this is where like if you can maybe give our audience some direct, like what for those people, I'm going to give a little background first, but like
Sure.
what core, like concrete things for healing do you recommend? Because I know you sprinkled them in here, but
Sure.
the connection, because you did say about trauma, for you, you couldn't identify any really like core traumas that impacted your
Yeah.
addiction. And
Yeah.
for others, they can. And yet, I'm a big Gabor Mate fan. So he always talks about like the opposite of addiction is connection, which then leads me
Yeah.
to like attachment theory in childhood, and also like the spirituality component of AA, and how research shows that being able to find those core connections and find spirituality and perspective in the world really helps in healing. So kind of using all of that information, how do you help people heal when they have
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
issues, whether it's like a diagnosable PTSD or not with
Sure.
addiction?
Sure. Yeah, and and I think that it's funny, you mentioned that it's like yes, the black and white, but it's like there's this thing we forgot about, this concept called nuance, and it's really important. It's just easier to paint, and I think we love black and white thinking. We want things to make sense, and I'm seeing this more and more because I want to put everything into a box. That way, I could better understand it. When it becomes this big mess, it's like I don't get it, I don't understand it. And so there's that tendency to want to just simplify and say it's this, it's that, and so that's like, and you probably know. It sounds like you definitely have a background, with addiction, clinically, maybe otherwise, but you have the harm reduction camp. It's kind of like politics. You have the harm reduction camp, and you got the more like kind of conservative 12. So I kind of view it as right wing, left wing, and they just scream at each other, and they like it's like oh this, and then like I'm stuck in the middle, like come on guys, can't we all get along? Like some people are better sometimes this, but it's just like there's no, yeah, anyway. So us more moderates, we're a dying breed out there. But anyway, to answer your question, so here I thought like I'm gonna like not give like an example, but I would say like here's a formula that I use for kind of run of the mill, right? Because like to throw out some statistics, like you're 3 to 5 times more likely to develop addiction if you've had trauma. So you can't work in substance use and not, as far as like sexual assaults, especially with with women, I think it's like 70%. I mean, it's a crazy high number. And sometimes there are some gender differences, and then too in the LGBTQ community, which I have a huge passion for. I mean, and that's a great example of addiction and trauma because I never like saying every, right, but let's just go ahead and say every LGBTQ person, especially ones who really do identify as gay, lesbian, who, because there's some folks, who are like, bi, and it's not their identity, nobody knows about it, and so it's not as much of it, let's just say, someone who really, I can't find the right words for it, but, they
Is
all,
socially open with
there
their
you
identity,
go.
gay, lesbian, straight, transgender. Yeah.
And I was like, pure or truly, I'm like, no, those don't work. I'm gonna get in trouble. But yeah, that really do have that more core identity with it. Um, and can't necessarily hide it and have to and can't really be themselves to a high level, all have significant trauma. I actually did like a little like my own personal research project And again, like this is just how I'm sorry, I'm talking like in roundabout ways. Eventually I'll get back to the question. But, one time I got to do like a little mini research project for the end of my psych degree. And I was able to pull all the charts of clients, and I started tracking in their intake paperwork. And it was like half of them experienced trauma or sexual abuse, like significant trauma, especially among the gay males, eating disorders. Like 30 to 50% at some point had some kind of issue with like anorexia, bulimia symptoms. A good percent of them, 30-40% HIV positive, especially among the males. And, so it's just these layers of trauma. And I noticed too that we have, there's a lot of high recidivism for addiction because it does become such a core part of who you are and your coping mechanisms. So I was like, why is it that there's so much recidivism? And I went and I looked at the charts and I did a review. I was actually looking for when I was putting together a little research for today. I was like, where did I have that? I'd like to see that again. But yeah, you have all these risk factors that stack up on each other. So let's take, your average run-of-the-mill treatment client, and even I do this with the folks that are more in the, having substance abuse, let's just call it, versus dependence. But I think the first part of the process is, and so I use the metaphor of like a pipe, right? And so trauma and negative adverse experiences, biology, it's like having a pipe in your basement and it starts to corrode and rust, and it happens over time. And the pipes are still working okay. And then sometimes there's a little bit of a leak that spring just kind of sprinkles out. And then you're like, oh, that's not good. You can take maybe a piece of tape or, put some gum on it, it's like, all right, that's good for a while. And then you more gum and more tape, and the pipe just keeps corroding, and you're like, well, I don't want to have to turn the water off, and I got to get a pipe, and I got to go to Home Depot, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing, or I got to hire someone, costs a lot of money. So it's like, all right, I'm just going to keep doing a patchwork. But then all of a sudden, like the pipe really springs a leak, and then you're like, oh, okay, maybe I'll just drain it, and then the pipe just ends up bursting. And I think sometimes, like with the, if we go too far into the trauma, it's like, well, we need to fix, we need to go in and fix the pipe and repair it, or put a new one in. But it's like, well, that's kind of hard when the basement is flooded with 3 feet of dirty water, and the water is shooting out. Like, we need to turn off the water. We need to clean up the basement. And that's that first part is like, we just need to get you off substances. And that's where like residential inpatient treatment could be good, because it takes you away from that environment where you have the cues and triggers to use. And so people often, will do better in an inpatient setting because it's not accessible. It's like your brain is like, it's really, really smart, and it knows, like, if it's like, you're going to have more cravings if it's more accessible. Whereas if you're in treatment, your brain's like, oh, okay, I mean, I'd have to check myself out of treatment, walk down the street to the gas station. And so it is a good, like, safe healing place. You'll still maybe have cravings, your body's going through habituation, withdrawal. And so, yeah, so it's like, you got to turn off the water supply. You got to get off substances, get a few months under your belt, make those connections, get involved in a community, right? We're talking about those folks who have more chronic-y, type addictions, or even, a more severe episodic addiction. So first things first, and then let's develop some coping skills, right? Same stuff with like DBT. That's why DBT works well I like that model for a lot of things. So it's like, let's just, flood you with coping skills and those. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, we are very therapy minded, but like BPD, yeah. DBT, our audience might not know what those mean.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So like borderline personality disorder, right? Which, that trauma reaction. I talked about that before, like a strong sensitivity to environment and needing the external coping. So DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which was meant for folks with borderline personality disorder who often have substance use compulsive behaviors, right? And trauma, really, like one of the key defining symptoms would be self-harm, suicidality, and so that's why in DBT is basically just like a boot camp for coping skills. And it's a very, I'd call it like almost more of a right-wing program when I think about it, but it's like, because it's very structured. It's not so loosey-goosey. And it's like, you need those really strong boundaries and structure. So that, at least that type of model of like, let's learn, it's that relapse prevention. So, it's just stabilizing your life in order to do that deeper healing work. And that's what I'm really trying to do more in my practice. Whereas just like the basic addiction stuff, or it's getting, and it's just a little boring for me, right? And a lot of it just because of my personal life too. I've been dealing with family, because even when you're in AA, it's like, and you're like have somewhat of a air of stability, you're going to have family members calling you. People know you're sober. I'm picking people up in the middle of the night. And so I've just been immersed in it. I've been going to a couple meetings a week for years and years and years. And it's just like, it gets exhausting. So, and I guess, I'm a bit of that novelty seeker too. So I like new intellectual pursuits and stuff. So that's sort of, the trauma, and there's all these other, focuses I have as well. But that's where I really like that, because I could take those folks and be like, all right, yeah, it's like, you're going to do the 100 level class in treatment. The 200, I'm like, come to me, we're going to do the 300 level. That's where it's fun, because it's like you're sober, you got some stability, you don't have those daily cravings at that point. Usually you form new habits. But now we're playing the long game. And I use this metaphor, and I use it actually for a lot of things. I'm a fan of like martial arts and like boxing and stuff like that. And I always say, okay, think about Mike Tyson, right? Back in the 80s, this guy's got, you got like 15 seconds in there with him, right? But it's like, imagine if you're someone who's like a really skilled boxer. Maybe you don't have that power, right? But you got a 12 rounds with Mike Tyson, and that's like your life, right? That's your whole life, is you have 12 rounds with Iron Mike. And you're skilled though, right? You've developed some skills. You've been training to get in there, right? That's like kind of like being in treatment. It's like I view like treatment as like boot camp, or a training camp. And you've already been in the ring a few times, and he's knocked you out like 12 times. You're like, all right, here we go. All right, now you're ready. You've done a training camp. You're skilled. You're quick. You're nimble. But you don't have that power. You can't knock out Mike per se. But you just got to get through 12 rounds and just stick them enough and maybe win on points. And so you get in the ring, and you have to be perfect, right? Like, and this is like if you have that chronic, alcoholism, I guess, yeah. So it's like you got to be, pretty damn perfect for 12 rounds, but Mike only has to be perfect for 1 second and knock you down. Now you get knocked down, not be knocked up, get up, dust yourself off, learn from your mistake. But some people get knocked out for good, and that's an overdose, that's a death, that's a severe and permanent injury. And for some people, that relapse could send them back into another 10, 20 years of this addictive cycle. Whereas if they avoided that one moment, and I call them critical moments, because you're not, when you have a year sober, you're not craving every day. But these moments come maybe once every 6 months, every year. And when you're in a craving mindset, I say you're delusional. You are, because craving is an emotional state. It happens in your midbrain and the deeper part of your brain. So in that moment, right, you don't realize this craving will go away in an hour, whatever. And sometimes too, if you really have a hard time, you have these series of cravings and you just get sick of it and you give in. But a lot of times, if you get through this critical moment, you may not have another one for a year, 6 months, where it's like someone, offers you a drink. And you're like, oh my God, and like, it's like the gorilla pops out of the bushes, says, hey, remember me? You're like, oh. But but yeah, so it's like, you really have to be diligent to protect your recovery. And even if you're doing like the harm reduction plan, right? If you're like, you set limits for your use, and you're like, it's like, okay, and maybe it's like the stakes aren't quite as high, it's not as imminent, but it's like you got to be really diligent. You set that limit of 6 drinks a week, and you start playing with that line. It is a slippery slope to going back to the old. We got to kind of start over from ground. Maybe not from ground zero. We don't have to start over, but we got to go back, dust off, and replan. So yeah, I guess step one is stop the water flow, clean up the basement, get some time, develop that community, develop those coping skills. and then come see me, because now we're gonna do the fun stuff. And by fun, I mean not fun. Which is dig into the past and trauma and what got us here. And you could start to do that as well. I mean, you do that in treatment. There is some trauma work, and now there's more and more trauma work being done. But a lot of times, right, and with especially when you're raw, like if you're in treatment for 28 days, there's only so much you could do. But there is some value to going in and learning about it, doing assignments, talking about it, hearing other people's stories, connecting with others. It's a healing. Again, it's just trauma therapy is not just therapy. There are, many things. So a lot of people get over their trauma, severe trauma, without trauma therapy, because they find certain things in their life that are healing experiences, healing relationships. So, when they, then they come to me and it's like, all right, let's dig in. And I want to make sure you're safe, calm, and able to resource. And then resourcing means, just like kind of what it sounds like. I have these tools at my disposal where I can mostly at will, right? We can only control our body so much, but at will, calm, because we're going to dig into some tough stuff, especially when we're getting to that PTSD level. The stuff that you've been trying to avoid, the stuff you put a concrete wall over, we're going to chip away at it, and we're going to clean it up, process it, so you still have access to this place, right? It's like the more trauma you have, it's like if it's in your house, the more garbage you pile up and put another wall and another wall, you're really limited to where you can go. You just took up a bunch of square feet just to, instead of throwing the garbage out, to just piling it. And a lot of people do that. I use that metaphor with a lot of folks who are, they like to have their well manicured lawn and their nice house. And you walk in, and then like you're giving the tour, like, we don't go into that room. Like, just don't, it's X up, like, don't go in there. And you could like see like the doors kind of bent because there's like stuff piling out, and it kind of, the smell's coming through. You're like, don't mind that area. Don't look what's behind the curtain. But how do we, heal that area so you could live a less restricted life? Because maybe you could, and a lot of people have done. I mean, people have gotten sober and lived great lives before, EMDR and other trauma therapies. But they had to live with that burden, and they were able to do it. But again, it's how happy do you want to be? How far do you want to take this thing? How deep do you want to go? Do you want to go from a level 4 to a 6, or do you want that 9? I mean, again, that's a significant improvement to do any of this work. And usually when you get sober, and this is actually another thing, when I was like doing a little more research, like kind of stood out to me, because like we don't really think about this as much. We always think about the addiction preceding the trauma, but a lot of times people who don't have trauma and they start experimenting and they get hooked on substances for other reason, they're more likely to experience trauma because they're putting themselves in high risk situations. And let me find this. I wrote this down. Substance use disorders, so for adolescents, 45 to 66% of substance use disorders precede the onset of trauma. There's a direct link between alcohol use and engagement in risky behavior, which adolescents may get hurt. But you could think about that, like, especially if you get like deep into the lifestyle, you're at trap houses, you're, like the things you witness and people overdosing and being more at risk of sexual assault. Being arrested, beat up. I mean, like all the things that come with that dark world of addiction. You're just, and then even just addiction in itself is a trauma. I mean, it is, going through a severe addiction is hell. It is hell on earth. And that in itself is quite traumatic. So sometimes even getting sober and healthy in a community, you're already going to start feeling better. But again, we talked about that at the beginning with the physical injury, is how far can we take the natural healing process before we hit that plateau and really need to get a little more technical, bring the surgeon in. And maybe that's a good little metaphor I could add, right? The trauma therapist is like the surgeon, and then like, the regular therapist going up is the physician and the physical therapist. But like every once in a while, if those don't work, we got to bring the surgeon and we got to cut you open. And there's risks and benefits to doing it. If trauma therapy were easy, then we would just, all go, we'd all go do it and it, go get healed up. But, there's, and I actually do use that metaphor, like with my, I had another injury, back from the martial art days. So I literally in a class, I ripped my pectoral muscle off of my shoulder. And the doctor said, he's like, so there's a couple things we could do. He goes, one, you could just leave it and you'll be okay. The muscle will kind of wither away. You'll have about 40% strength in your pectoral. So it's weird because I could like do a shoulder press, but like if I tried to do a push-up, I'd collapse. And he's like, it'll heal to a certain degree. You'll adjust. Your shoulder will get stronger to make up. You'll never have that same strength. The other option is we cut in. We put you under, we cut in, and I'm going to sew your pectoral back to your shoulder. And he's like, depending on how much muscle is sitting in there, I could get it back to about 90, even 100%. And I'm like, he's like, but here's the thing, we're going to, this is a big surgery. You're going to go under. You're not going to, it's going to be 3-6 month healing process. And I was sitting there like, well, do I want to do that? Like really invasive, like surgery and have to heal? And then, it's like, and it was funny because it was like, I was starting my second semester of grad school, like the next day. I'm like, oh, I got to do a surgery and I'm going to fall behind. And, but I think that was like a really good metaphor. And he said, look, you're young and, you're athletic, you're whatever. So like, I recommend doing it. So I ended up doing it. And yeah, it was a long recovery. I was in a sling. It was the middle of winter. I'm slipping on the ice. But eventually now it is about 90 something percent healed. And it's probably less likely to tear again because you really sewed it on good. So I'm back to like 100%, but I had to do that really intense surgery. Whereas I could have just let it heal to a certain degree. It would be better than day one. It would be better than month 3. It would be better than 1 year. And I'd find a new homeostasis. I'd find a new balance in life. But I wouldn't be at 100%. But I'm glad I did it because now I'm not as limited. So I think that is that good physical example of like the physical and mental trauma parallel.
That's something I often share with my clients. The example I give is like short-term consequence, long-term benefit. So even though that recovery in the moment felt long, in the grand scheme of your life, that was a really short-term consequence with lots of long-term benefit. And then I also loved, like when you were describing your formula for healing, I often tell people like your DBT calling it boot camp with the dialectical behavioral therapy skills, because I think one of the biggest pieces I do for people is normalize that no one ever gave you the formula for these things. No one ever handed you the coping skills, right? So American society specifically, we don't put an emphasis on mental health. It's not really in our schools. Everything you learn, you might get a formula for a math problem. And if you didn't have the formula to do that math problem, you'd never be able to solve it, right? So I just normalize for people, of course, you have no idea how to communicate with people. Of course, you don't know how to think through this and emotionally regulate. Of course, let's give you the formula to do those things with some coping skills. And now you can kind of learn how to figure that out.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Evan, we could talk forever, but I don't want to go. We're already at an hour and I don't want our listeners to not tune in because we're talking forever and we'll have to have you on again. But I do want to have you leave us with one thing, like a mantra, a saying, an affirmation. Like what's something you want to leave our audience with?
Oh man, I should have thought of something like that before.
That's okay. It doesn't have to be something super.
I guess in the, just in the spirit of what you just said is like invest in yourself. Every dollar you invest in yourself, you get 3 on the other end, right? It's a short period of your life. And with no risk, with no investment, there's no reward. An investment is sacrificing something I want now so that I get a return on it later. And that's kind of what therapy is. I mean, that's what getting sober is too. It's like I'm giving up what I want in this moment. I want to get high, but if I do that on the back end, I get a beautiful, life. Same with trauma therapy. So so invest in yourself. I would say that's the best I could do.
That's a good one. I think we forget about that often because a lot of times trauma history, limiting beliefs, some people might not think they're worthy enough to invest in themselves. So I think that's always a good reminder.
For sure.
Thank you so much for being here. We will definitely be talking more. I think we're going to have you on the men's mental health series, which I'm really excited about, that my husband Tommy does. So that will be a good one. And then to the rest of our audience, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. If you have any further questions for Evan, I can make sure to get his contact information to kind of include in the show notes, or we can get those passed along to you. And then stay tuned, because next week, breaking down more stigmas, we're breaking the stigma of real talk on BDSM, kink, and more. So that's going to be a really awesome episode.
Next time, can we talk about?
Literally, like, you can come back anytime. So it's another TikToker that we met that is going to be talking about those things that we're really excited about. Her name is Kira. So,
that's awesome.
Thank you all. And thanks again, Evan. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful week.
Yeah. Thank you so much. See you later.
Bye.